Hey everybody, welcome as we return back this week for our continuation through the Westminster Shorter Catechism. Over the last several weeks, we've been talking about man in the first couple chapters of Genesis, through the creation and the estate in which man was created, in being that man was created in the image of God. He entered into this covenant of life with God, this covenant of life which had the condition of maintaining a perfect obedience with God. Adam having the ability to do this based on being left to the freedom of his own will that we talked about a couple weeks ago, um, to keep or to stay in this perfect obedience with God. This covenant of life also had a warning, and specifically forbidding the eating of the fruit from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And in that, God even gave us the consequence for that, which was death. So our parents, we learned a couple weeks ago in question 13, it says, our first parents fell from the estate wherein they were created by sinning against God. So they chose not to stay in perfect obedience, but to sin against God. Well, what is sin? We talked about last week. It says sin is any want of conformity unto or transgression of the law of God. So anything that goes against the law of God. Question 15 is the one we're on this week, which says, what was the sin whereby our first parents fell from the estate wherein they were created? The answer to that is the sin whereby our first parents fell from the estate wherein they were created was their eating the forbidden fruit, this forbidden fruit that we've talked about already. We see this in Genesis 3, verse 6. It says, so when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate. And she also gave some to her husband who was with her, and he ate. So they sinned against God. It was a sin for eating this fruit. It was sin specifically that was forbidden by God in the first place. But it's just one sin, right? I mean, how many times do we sin a day? Could we even count it? Why is it such a big deal? Would we think of it differently if maybe I told you that in breaking this sin, he actually broke all 10 of the 10 commandments? Let's look at that for a minute. Now, the 10 commandments are a summary of the laws of God. It's what's contained in it as the laws of God. And we see this given to Moses, God speaking this to Moses in Exodus 20. But let's walk through them quickly. It says, so you shall have no other gods before me. Well, Adam, he's wants this fruit. He's being self-centered in this fruit. He knows that this fruit is to make him like God. The serpent tells him that. So he's trying to make himself like God. You shall not worship other gods. Well, Adam has decided in his heart that he is going to serve God according to Adam's will, not according to God's commands. So in essence, his desires or his wants become its own God that gets put, that he ends up worshiping. You shall not take the Lord's name in vain. Well, by sinning and doing this, he's going specifically against, doing specifically the thing that God told him not to do. So he's really profaning God's name in this. Remembering the Sabbath day to keep it holy. Well, as a result of this sin, none of us can worship God or man is incapable of worshiping God as we should as a result of this. Honor your father and mother. Well, Adam committed this sin. The only authority he had was God. So he is dishonoring his father, his holy and inerrant father, which is really the only authority in his life. So next one is murder. Well, he didn't kill anybody. Well, wait a minute. Isn't the consequence for this death? So in essence, he really he murdered himself in doing this as a result. Committing adultery. As soon as they did this, their eyes were open. They see each other and covered their nakedness with leaves as a result of this sin. Stealing. Well, they took from the fruit, this fruit that was not theirs to begin with. It was not theirs to touch, not theirs to eat. Bearing false witness. He testifies falsely to God himself when asked about what he's doing. Coveting. He wasn't content with all. He's in this garden, this beautiful garden that has everything, all these good things in it. But this one thing that you can't have, specifically told you cannot have it, but I want it. And so he's coveting there. So that's all 10 commandments. So think about it. Now it's kind of a lot bigger thing than I thought maybe in the beginning. So I think this is helpful for us in seeing that sometimes sin is actually a lot bigger than we really realize. We may see this little small thing and look at it and say, well, it's not that big a deal. But if we look at the heart of it, our intentions behind it, our mind behind it, and the things that are actually affected by it, we may find out that there's a lot of things rooted in that are really, we're just talking about the surface of that one small sin when there's really a lot more things deeper in that. Thinking back again, I mentioned about the freedom of our own will. So our first parents had the freedom of their own will. They had the ability to choose to do good and still chose to do bad, which is slightly different than us in that we do not have the ability to do good without God at this point after the fall. But we've been talking about this for several weeks. We've kind of inched along, and each one gives a little more detail. Why is this so important? Why is this first sin that resulted in the fall of our first parents and means so much to us and to the Christian faith? Well, I hate to give you a cliffhanger here, but we're actually going to talk about that next week. If you will, that is our next question. Now, you can read ahead and see the next question in your books, but we're going to talk about that more next week. But what I'd like you to focus on this week is we talked some about sin last week, and I'd like you to think some more about it in that this week, think about how simple sin is could actually be more than we think. Have you ever heard the term little white lie? Think about a little white lie may be a lot more than we really think it is. It may be a lot more than what we want others to think it is. But think about those things. Pray about those things. Pray that God would open your eyes and reveal some of these things to you, so in order that you can pray for them, ask for forgiveness from Him in these blessings to you this week.